Let me open us in prayer. God, thanks for bringing us together tonight, even from different places, different distances. The weather can't stop a Zoom meeting most of the time, so we're happy to be together. We ask that you'd be with us as we just continue our conversation about who we're called to be in your world. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So we'll minimize some of the intro that I've been doing over the last couple weeks, but um, I will say each time that our goal here is to get kind of comfortable with our own faith so that we can kind of engage the culture in a way that is more confident for us and more effective in our faith. And some of that's about knowing our faith. Some of it, though, is also about knowing the history of our faith. And that's been the focus of this class, at least for this first segment. When we take a break and reconvene in the new year, we'll look more at some present day things and maybe some questions that we can learn some language for. Um, because we all want to be able to respond knowledgeably, but also lovingly when we encounter things that either do or don't represent Jesus in a faithful way. Because there's big questions in our culture, and people of faith and people of no faith are looking for answers. And sometimes the Bible's helpful, as in questions of ethics or love of neighbor. Sometimes the Bible informs us about who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to be, even when the answers to our questions come from other places. And so that always directs us back to the question that we've been asking each week. How do we know what we know? And how does that shape how we engage the world around us? And so for the first few weeks, we started with the Scopes trial because it was a public debate over these very questions, and because it still has influence even a century later. All of you have heard this already, so I'll keep this part brief, but it's a trial of a teacher for teaching evolution in a public school. There had been a law passed to make that illegal, and this teacher allowed himself to be arrested for it so it could be a test case that would work its way through the judicial system. Um, but remember, just along the way, pardon me, I have to cough again. um, Along the way, that we talked about how William Jennings Bryan, who was the defender of biblical literacy, his concern about evolution was that a world that was governed by the survival of the fittest was couldn't be a loving society, couldn't be a loving culture. Uh, to put it in biblical terms, Brian believed that survival of the fittest made it impossible for us to love our neighbors. And so, on the surface, it was a trial over the curriculum in Tennessee. But what it became was kind of this nationwide event on the relationship between faith and culture. Uh, and what I said over the last couple of weeks is that the way the trial was interpreted and told in the press, that's what's had a lasting impact. Last time I read you this quote, and we looked at it on a slide that H.L. Mencken, the famous columnist, wrote that Darrow lost his case. It was lost long before he came to Dayton. But it seems to me, this is H.L. Mencken, it seems to me that he has nevertheless performed a great public service by fighting it to a finish and in a perfectly serious way. The trial serves notice on this country that Neanderthal man is organizing in these forlorn backwaters of the land, led by a fanatic, rid of sense and devoid of conscience. So that's what stuck for people, is that the whole idea was that these fundamentalists were going to try and take over and stop. serious learning in the schools and send America backwards. It, you know, if we just read our newspapers now, it's a valid fear. Again, not the way I would have addressed that fear, trying to make a law to make teaching science illegal. But these concerns are still present today, and I want to thank Cliff and Lois for giving me this article. This is a letter to the editor in Prescott, Arizona. Listen to what this person wrote to a newspaper. It doesn't have a date on it, but apparently recently. Said, "Dear editor, since 1996, there have been 2,918 school shootings in the United States. In them, 855 people were killed and another 2,385 were wounded. The pundits can't understand why this is happening." This is what the person in the letter says. "The reason it is happening is because our public schools are teaching evolution and deep time theories as if they were facts of science. These theories teach that the law of biogenesis was somehow overcome and life came from non-life and humans evolved from pond scum. When you believe you come from pond scum rather than understanding that God made you in his image, you come to believe that your life has no meaning or purpose, which means there is no objective rule of morality, and all morality is based on your own personal opinion. So when the masses believe this, why wouldn't they shoot up our schools?" I'll stop it there, but uh, that's in 2025. The reason there are school shootings is because we teach evolution in the schools. So how did society respond in 1925 and 26 and in the years after to the trial? We talked about this last week. It's Mencken's caricature of the South and of Christians in the South that tended to stick. Uh, America in the 20s was pretty much went on with its business. Huge social change. That's when cars and telephones became widely used. We talked about some of this at the 150th on Saturday. People started to listen to radio and go out to movies. The 19th Amendment became law in 1920, and that gave women the right to vote. So all through the 20s, women are voting in their first elections. There's huge economic growth. Though part of that was due to a lack of regulation of the markets, and we're going to see that in 1929 with the stock market crash. The mainstream of American society moved on after the Scopes trial, and if they thought about it at all, they remembered it through H.L. Mencken's eyes. It wasn't the same for people who were Christians, especially the very traditionalist Christians. The modernist Christians tended to side with the wider culture. They were very open to science, and they didn't have a problem with the teaching of evolution. But the traditionalists started to separate from anyone who didn't agree with them. Some of this was happening before the Scopes trial, but it really, after the Scopes trial, the traditionalists separated themselves from anything that didn't conform to the narrow boundaries of fundamentalist Christianity. And this is a serious retreat. The traditionalists or the fundamentalists retreated from institutions, from charities, from schools, universities and colleges, from academic societies, and from government. I said this last week because it's always a surprise for most people that in those years between 1925 and 1980, it was evangelicals and fundamentalists who were less likely to participate in politics. It was the mainline churches who were seen to be part of society that included government. And honestly, that's when people started putting flags in churches. It wasn't in the evangelical and fundamentalist churches. It was in the mainline churches like Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Methodists. Um, During this time, Christian K through 12 education exploded in growth. Christian Bible colleges were founded or rediscovered and reinvested in to give Christian young people safe places to learn. In other words, places where they would learn, where the Bible would be the main textbook in every class, and they wouldn't be tempted to learn evolution or other forms of modern science. Um, the humiliation of the Scopes trial led traditionalist, fundamentalist Christians, to create a society within a society that was separate from both modernist Christians and also secular culture. One important historian, George Marsden, said that in their retreat from society, fundamentalists took it on themselves to preserve their understanding of what it meant to be an American. This should help us understand some of what we're hearing today from the extreme wing of Christian nationalists, that somehow being an American means being a Christian as they define it, even though that doesn't look like traditional Christianity anymore at all. By the end of the 1930s, some fundamentalists wanted to rejoin society, or at least they wanted to rejoin other Christian organizations and churches. So if you guys like it when I drop book names, then I'll say that a guy named Joel Carpenter wrote a book called Revive Us Again in the late 90s. And he tells this story of what fundamentalists were up to uh, in the years after the Scopes trial and before they started to re-engage with the culture. Out of this generation of separatism, and let me give you an idea of separatism. Um, it comes from a Bible verse in the New Testament where um, these words are put into God's mouth. Um, come ye out and be ye separate. It basically means, or was interpreted to mean, leave any organization or friendship or relationship or church that doesn't believe that Christ is who he says he is. Now, the way fundamentalists defined that was very narrow, and they were forever splitting and dividing over doctrinal issues. But a lot of people, a handful of people in the late 30s who grew up in that kind of separatist fundamentalism, they started a new trend toward cooperation, at least with other Christians. That may sound like a small advance to us, but this is a huge development in the basically in the 40s during World War II and in the years after. Um, these groups started to relax their hard boundaries and cooperate with other Christian organizations um, to work for a common cause, even if some of their theologies might be different. One of those organizations was Youth for Christ. There was a concern in the years immediately following World War II that the youth of America were leaving the Christian faith and running wild in the streets. Youth for Christ was an organization that was formed specifically to counter this, what was perceived to be this wild youth culture after World War II. Their first star speaker was a very young Billy Graham. Billy Graham really gets famous in the 50s and 60s, but on Memorial Day in 1945, so the war in the Pacific is still going on. By Memorial Day of 1945, Germany had already surrendered. But so the war is still going on. On Memorial Day in 1945, 70,000 young people came to hear Billy Graham at Soldier Field in Chicago. And there were rallies like this um, all over big cities in America. um, so, Youth for Christ is one of these organizations where um, different denominations, different kinds of Christians worked together for a common cause. In 1942, a pastor from New England named J. Elwyn Wright gathered a bunch of evangelical leaders and talked to them about how much separatism was damaging the church. And together they formed the National Association of Evangelicals. This is a moderate organization. This was a step away from fundamentalism in 1942. Wright was tired of all the division and separation, and the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, was designed to be a voice for cooperative evangelism. I have the pamphlets from their first meetings and the minutes of their very first meetings. Um, this was an attempt to not be fundamentalists and still be traditionalist Christians. I should note that there was huge opposition among fundamentalists to the forming of the National Association of Evangelicals. Another organization that came out of this era was World Vision, which started in 1950 as a cooperative missions agency that welcomed different denominations and churches to work together, primarily in the beginning in Korea, which was at war at the time. So the Korean War is from 1950 to 1953. World Vision is already there trying to provide assistance and food and meet physical needs for the people of the country. World Vision to this day has strict rules about not evangelizing. So it's an evangelical Christian organization, but it does not proselytize. It does not try and win converts. World Vision is a network of agencies all over the world that meet physical needs. Also around this time, some fundamentalist, traditionalist preachers started using the radio as a way of communicating their ministries and spreading their message to a wider audience. There's a handful of these, but I'm just going to talk about one tonight because some of them had massive radio audiences. The biggest of them was the Old Fashioned Revival Hour. Anybody here ever listen to the Old Fashioned Revival Hour? At one point, um, the Old Fashioned Revival Hour had 20 million listeners. It was one of the highest rated radio programs in America. Uh, it was led by a man named Charles Fuller. Uh, the Revival Hour was a gentle, calm, very homey, folksy kind of uh, hour of Bible teaching and hymns. Charles Fuller and his wife, Grace Fuller, would chat and talk and read letters from listeners, and Charles would give the sermons. By 1942, the Old Fashioned Revival Hour was heard every single Sunday across North America, as well as all over Europe and Africa and Asia over the Mutual Broadcasting System. And like I said, at its height, it had over 20 million listeners. So what would that be? That's the population of the U.S. at that time was probably around 200 million. I'm just guessing. But that's 10% of America listening to this one preacher's program. Now, an interesting story about the Old Fashioned Revival Hour is that in the 30s, the early version of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, provided free radio time for religious broadcasting. The idea was that it was good for society. So there were Catholic radio preachers and different Protestants, and Fuller's program took advantage of this, and they used that free radio time for his program. But the program was so popular that the leaders of the denominations complained to the FCC, and they dropped the old-fashioned revival hour. It lost its free radio time. So Charles Fuller, uh, because it was too expensive for him personally to buy radio time every week, he started recording the programs a week in advance. And they had a network of radio markets all over the country that bought his program and played it. So there's a historian that credits Charles Fuller with inventing syndicated programming. So, Seinfeld was on regular television for, I don't know, 8 or 10 years, but the real money came afterwards when Seinfeld was sold into individual television markets. People paid for the privilege of showing Seinfeld because then they could sell ad time. Charles Fuller's radio program got sold in individual markets all over the country. And instead of it costing Charles Fuller money, it actually made him money. It was still supported by listeners, but he started to amass a small fortune at that time. And what he did with his money was he founded Fuller Theological Seminary. Full disclosure, that's where I went. I got 2 degrees from Fuller. I worked for Fuller for 4 years. I was an adjunct instructor in preaching at Fuller, and I wrote my dissertation about part of Fuller's history. So we're getting into my wheelhouse here as we talk about this part. Um, Fuller's dream, Charles Fuller's dream, as as somebody who had been raised in fundamentalism. His dream was a place where traditional evangelicals could study and do serious research, and that the work they produced would be equal in quality to the scholarly work in major universities. So by definition, they were clearly not separatist. They were willing to have some latitude on the edges of what people believed and the way that they practiced their Christian faith. They were clearly in the traditionalist camp, but they weren't militant about it. In other words, they weren't looking. Fuller very rarely ever got rid of a faculty member for not being conservative enough. It happened, but in its whole history, it may have happened once or twice, and it happened in the early years. Turns out, Fuller Seminary was part of a movement that was already happening in the early 40s. A group of young men who had grown up in fundamentalist traditions, but who were gifted academically, they wanted to get rid of the separatism of their movement and earn their degrees in the great universities. And a small handful of them applied to Harvard and completed their PhDs there. These scholars became the next generation of evangelical leaders, and a lot of them ended up teaching at Fuller Seminary. Now, a lot of them ended up teaching at Fuller Seminary because the conservative seminaries, the fundamentalist seminaries, wouldn't take them back because they had gotten their degrees outside the fold. And so one of these men was a man named Edward Carnell. And Edward Carnell got a doctorate in theology from Harvard, and at the same time earned a PhD in philosophy on a different topic from Boston University. His 2 degree programs overlapped by a couple of years, and he finished both of them. So when he graduated, he had not one but two doctorates from two different institutions. And he was still in he might have been 30 years old at the time. So Ed Carnell came to be on the faculty at Fuller. And when he was looking back on his career in the 60s, I'm going to put this up as a slide. Um, Ed Carnell, he said this: one of my difficulties is that I have sort of painted myself into a corner. I know perfectly well that the literalism, the fundamentalism of a century ago, both Catholic and Protestant, needs careful rethinking. But I also know perfectly well that our rethinking is all in vain unless we stay within the guidelines provided by the scripture's view of itself. Now, I'm just going to say what he's saying here. He gets that fundamentalism is a problem, but he doesn't want to rethink it so much that he loses his traditional evangelical beliefs. In other words, he wants to be an evangelical, but he doesn't want to be a jerk about it. That's my language. And so here's what he says: the upshot, the end result is that I end up, so it seems, being a liberal in the eyes of the literalists and a literalist in the eyes of those who have joined the mad race for relevance. In other words, the people the modernists in our story. He wrote that in 1966. Uh, he came to Fuller as a faculty member. He was briefly the president, but the pressure of being the president of the seminary led to some significant mental illness, and he ended up dying very young, in his 50s, um, alone in a hotel room where he had been invited, someplace where he had been invited to speak. Uh, it was it was a difficult and dangerous thing for people who had been raised in fundamentalism to leave fundamentalism and come back into the culture. Fundamentalism had created their own little society within a society. And by going to Harvard and Boston University and Yale and the University of Chicago, um, the other great universities of the day, they had they were basically excommunicated from their own fundamentalist communities. And many of them suffered decades of loneliness and separation because of their decision to get degrees in secular universities and to associate with people who weren't strict fundamentalists. Just to give you an idea of how absurd separatism could become, uh, when a historian that I know was writing the history of Fuller Seminary, he was interviewing a man who had been a part of the seminary's founding, and whose son had become one of these more moderate evangelicals. When the interviewer told the dad that he had spoken to his son, the dad said, "Well, then I can't speak to you because you're speaking to people who aren't strict fundamentalists." So it's not only separatism, it's what they call second order separatism. You don't just separate from people who disagree with you, you separate from anyone who associates with somebody who disagrees with you. It's a it's a built-in dysfunction and source of pain and anger that doesn't excuse, but it explains a little bit of the Christian nationalists that we see these days. They're so angry about keeping their hard boundaries and keeping anyone out who believes something different than they do that they don't associate with anybody other than themselves. And so one of the other guys who decided to break free of fundamentalism was a man named George Eldon Ladd. Now, George Ladd is, I wrote my dissertation and then later wrote a book about George Eldon Ladd. So we're going to end with him because he's somebody that I know well and he's a great example of this. Uh, George Eldon Ladd grew up in a tradition that we would call fundamentalists. They didn't associate with anybody else. They didn't dance. They didn't. There were no alcohol. There were all kinds of things that they had the hugest rule book you can imagine, and a very strict way of um, of approaching theology and church tradition. In other words, they would never go to a Presbyterian church because we have some latitude about, well, they ordained my wife. So women were not allowed to be ministers in these traditions. And so, right off the bat, because we ordain women, a fundamentalist would never associate with us. So, George Ladd grew up in this tradition, but he was brilliant. And he wanted to sort of test himself in a in one of the secular universities, and he's one of the young men in the early 40s that went to Harvard. Now, there's a coincidence here, not a coincidence, but it's an alignment of things. All of these fundamentalist young men who applied to Harvard applied at a time when Harvard was having a hard time getting PhD students because of the war. So there were open spaces and there was scholarship money for PhD students to come. And it was a little moment in time where maybe these men wouldn't have been accepted at Harvard in the 30s or the 50s, but in the 40s, there was an opportunity for these men to go and study with the best scholars in the world. And that's what George Ladd did. Ladd had a professor who was his main professor at Harvard, who was in every way a theological liberal and a political liberal. He was a pacifist. He came from a Quaker tradition, um, and but Ladd loved him. Ladd came to respect him, and it changed the way Ladd saw the wider range of Christian traditions in America. And it changed him, and he took that into his teaching career. He was a professor at Fuller for 30 years. Graduated from Harvard in with a PhD in 1949, and he came to Fuller in 1950. All of this is part of this question: how do we know what we know, and how do we engage the world with what we know? The fundamentalists decided not to engage the wider world at all. And this next group of people who became the leaders, these are the people who founded Fuller. They established the magazine Christianity Today, which still exists. They were involved in, like I said, the National Association of Evangelicals. They did a lot of things that a generation before them people would not have done. And I just have to say, I'm a product of this group. I never had the fundamentalist background, but I was taught by people um, who who were taught by these folks. So my main New Testament professor when I went to seminary was one of George Ladd's students. And so there's a lineage now of people who are willing to take serious learning and engage the culture, even if the culture disagrees with you. And so the reason I tell all of this is that what happens in the Scopes trial is that the traditionalist Christians, they retreat out of society. But but some of them wanted to re-engage. And even though they would be what we would call now evangelicals, uh, these are the moderates in the story. These are the ones who didn't want to have those closed doors and hard edges. They wanted to engage not only other Christians but the wider culture. So so you have this group of evangelicals who are engaging society. They're getting degrees at major universities. They're writing books and papers that are published by academic presses. No fundamentalist would have ever wanted to do that, let alone been able to do that. All of this is kind of growing and swelling and becoming more powerful until it all blows up in 1957. Uh, and it blows up over Billy Graham, of all people.
Really?
So Billy Graham was preaching to large crowds. Like I said, as early as 1945, he drew 70,000 young people to Soldier Field in Chicago. And he's doing these crusades in major cities around the country. Incidentally, he comes to Los Angeles in the early 50s to start one of his crusades, and it's largely a failure. Nobody's coming. Nobody comes until Charles Fuller mentions him on his radio program. And that's when people started to crowd into the Billy Graham crusade that ended up leading all kinds of Hollywood celebrities to Christian faith. And it's a major moment in the Christian history of Los Angeles. But in 1957, Billy Graham um, wanted to launch one of his crusades, his meetings in New York City. And New York City has dozens of established denominational churches that that supported him, but they were still Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopalian, even Roman Catholic. And so Billy Graham fills Madison Square Garden, but behind him, sitting up on the stage with him, are leaders from all of these other church traditions. That was too much for his fundamentalist supporters. And they separate from Billy Graham. They reject Billy Graham in 1957, and the strictest of them, they have stayed away from Billy Graham for the last 75 years now. Um, and it was because Billy Graham was cooperating with other traditions that didn't have the same theology as he did. When I talk about this in a different, I give a whole lecture on this event. I say, for Billy Graham, the 18,000 people in front of him were more important than the 15 guys behind him who happened to come from different denominations. He cared about the people he was preaching to more than he cared about who was supporting him. But for most of us, for most of us who in our minds have a distinction between fundamentalists and evangelicals, that distinction starts in 1957, and it starts over Billy Graham. Hard
Really?
to imagine now Billy Graham being the reason evangelicals decided to divide with themselves, but that's just a strange part of the story. And so we're going to continue this part next week because evangelicalism has some other um, movements that it's going to spawn, and some of those we're feeling the effects of in our own culture today. But the main thing here is that Christians, after the Scopes trial, have had to figure out how they were going to engage the rest of society. Some left, some tried to come back, some tried to come back and then left again. And so by 1957, here we are. We have a group of angry, militant fundamentalists on one side, and we have a group of evangelicals who are trying to hold to their traditional beliefs, but also become reconnected to society. George Ladd, the guy that I wrote about, he gave papers in all of the major academic societies. He studied at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. Uh, all of these, I should say, not all, but this small group of Christian intellectuals in the 40s and 50s really changed the way evangelicalism was seen in the United States. And we'll pick up that story next week. Let me unmute you. That's a lot of history in one evening, but not like when I did the creeds and I did 800 years of church history in one night. But um, some of you lived through some of these things, I would imagine. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a Billy Graham gathering. I have, yeah. And Billy Graham was one of the original trustees of Fuller Seminary in 1947. Early, probably by about 1950, he became a trustee once he started to get even more famous. But you can see the way the question of how do we engage society in faith is getting answered during this period that we talked about tonight through World Vision, through these big youth ministries like Youth for Christ, these radio ministries, and uh, and Fuller Seminary. This way of re-engaging academic culture. Um, that's what I wrote my book on, which is how a group of evangelicals tried to restore evangelical scholarship in America in the 50s and 60s. Um, but in the end, they're just people and they're trying to figure this out just like we are. Um, but some of them, looking back, made decisions that really divided and split and damaged the church in ways that haven't really been helpful 50 years later. So, what do you guys have to say about this? Yeah, please, Karen.
I was thinking, I wish I could speak with my father. He would have been about 10 when that happened. But he grew
Huh.
up in a small northern Minnesota farm community, and he grew
Uh-huh.
up in a Swedish mission church,
Huh.
which I'm
Uh-huh.
assuming was pretty fundamental. Because at different times he had told me that he never saw a movie until he was an adult. And I asked him,
Yeah.
I said, well, you didn't have a theater in town? And he said, oh, yeah, but the church didn't allow it.
Yeah.
And so he never drank, and he
Yeah.
was pretty much a teetotaler his whole life.
Mm.
But I don't think my dad really, he was always involved in church, but he pretty much went to the church that his wife went to. So,
Ah.
first of all, he went to a Lutheran college. So that's
Oh
pretty
yeah.
cool. He went to Concordia in Moorhead.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And then he married my mother, who was raised in the Swiss Reformed Church,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
has joined with the Congregational Church. And
Mm.
so as a child, we went to the Congregational Church.
Mm.
Then, after my mother died and he married a Lutheran, then he was a Lutheran.
Yeah.
But he was always active in the church, but he never talked about what you believe in the Bible and that kind of thing. And I don't think that he
Mm.
really, I don't know that he thought that much about it. I don't know.
Mm. Mm.
But but so he did, he wasn't stuck in that fundamental
Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Shelley grew up in a tradition like this. She she told one of her youth leaders that she thought she wanted to be a pastor, and the youth leader corrected her and said, "No, you mean a pastor's wife." And she said, "No, I mean a pastor." And she said, "No, you mean a pastor's wife." And of course, the funny thing is now is she's both, but uh, that's because she left that tradition and joined a Presbyterian church uh, in her adulthood. Um, but I grew up in a town that had a really big, very conservative, almost fundamentalist church. Um, and but I grew up in a kind of a warmly evangelical Presbyterian church. And first off, they didn't think I was a real Christian, some of them, because I went to a Presbyterian church. And we knew a lot of them when we were in high school. And when I went to UCLA, an even bigger group of them thought I wasn't a Christian. Because why didn't I go to Biola or Westmont? Why didn't I mean, even Westmont was considered a little lefty to them. Um, and so they went to places like Dallas, Dallas Baptist. They went to Biola in Orange County. There were very strict. The smart ones went to Wheaton. Wheaton was a very conservative evangelical school, but it had excellent academics, like Westmont does now. Um, but yeah, when I said I was going to UCLA, I could see some of them literally visibly shaking their heads like, "Oh, he's going to hell."
Well,
Uh,
I had an interesting group of people, preachers that came from Tennessee and Texas. Some of them were very conservative, and the church I grew up in didn't believe in dancing or pet cards or going to movies or anything. But
right.
every now and then we'd get a preacher who was more liberal and who would talk about different things. And then they would get mad at him. And because it
Yeah.
was independent, they'd fire him. And then we'd get another one. So we came and went from extreme orthodoxy to liberal, sort of
Yeah.
liberal. So
Yeah.
that was interesting as a child to go to uh, very conservative rallies when the Negro preacher would come and we'd all meet together. And then
Uh,
we'd go to this church that didn't believe you should go to any other church and you were going to hell if you did.
yeah.
it
Yeah.
was it was it was very interesting.
You know, this happens sometimes in other countries, but not nearly as much as in the US. And one of the explanations for that is that a lot of countries, a lot of European countries had established churches. So there was the Church of Scotland, and there's the Church of England, and there's the established church in Germany is what we would call the Lutheran Church. Um, but there's a Swedish Lutheran Church and a Norwegian Lutheran Church. There are these were all national churches, and so in some ways it wasn't the same free market that you have in the US. And so some of them are supported by, uh, the state churches. Oftentimes, the established churches get their funding from the state, and so there isn't this competition for members to make your budget, which is one of the things that marks American churches. Uh, it's a Wild West kind of free market out there, and everybody's trying to get. A lot of times, we're all trying to evangelize the same people and get and have them become members in our church. Um, and people leave churches easily here, where that would be unheard of in a place where you grew up with an established church. Um, and so it's just a different experience over here. Um, and it makes for a different church culture. Church historians write about this a lot. I mean, there's volumes and volumes of books trying to analyze this marketplace Christianity where um, you know everybody's trying to get just like a product. You're trying to get market share. Um, so anyway,
That, yeah, that makes me think. Yeah, I spent 40 years living in Orange County, which has lots of churches.
yeah,
And when we were looking for a church, we looked for the church that agreed with us.
yeah,
We didn't just go to the only church and then learn from them and begin to agree with them. So,
yeah,
like you said, we just looked around. We found, oh yeah, they believe like we do.
yeah. That's a very uh, that's a very common story in the U.S. You sort of you find a church that you like instead of going to the local parish church. Because most of these established churches, they divide up the country into parishes, like the Catholic Church does.
Right. Yeah.
You grow up in a parish, that's your church. You wouldn't think about going to a Catholic church 2 towns away just because they had a priest that you liked better. Your
Right.
priest at your local church, would baptize you, marry you, and bury you because they'd be there for decades. Um, so it's a different animal. It really becomes apparent in the preachers that went on the radio because media is so expensive that it they really did fight tooth and nail for market share. Charles Fuller and a couple of other radio preachers are all a lot of them were they would criticize each other to try and get their listeners. So it's just it's not our best moment. Um, but the one of the achievements of Fuller Seminary is that it created a place where traditionalist Christians, I've been saying traditionalist instead of conservative all the time because that has other connotations to it. But so traditionalist Christians could be academically free. Now, even that has limits, and Fuller's trying to figure out some of those limits. But Fuller was one of the early places in the evangelical tradition to train women for ministry, and they lost a lot of supporters for that. What they gained was great students because women had to achieve more in the 60s and 70s and 80s to go to seminary. Honestly, I was a youth leader at my church. I said I wanted to go to seminary. They basically they couldn't wait to send me to seminary. Women had to prove themselves at the church level. Uh, they had a stricter time, a harder time getting to seminary. So by the time they got to seminary, honest to goodness, the women I knew in seminary were top drawer pastors in training. Men could be average. The women were all good. The women were all good preachers. The men, yeah, there's some of those guys. I never would have gone to their church, Karen. um, and so, but Fuller was cutting edge in some of those things, even though it was still a traditionalist evangelical school. Um, so,
But seeing all these people differ in the church and different churches gives you a different perspective, and it's very uncomfortable sometimes. You try to figure out which one of these people really have anything to say and
yeah,
who is really for Christ, who is really wanting to help other people and to be good people.
yeah,
That's the thing about young people these days, why they're so mixed up. There's so many points of view.
right. And so the thing that is this country's strength, which is uh, diversity of opinion and I can say all I want about the sort of free market world of churches, it keeps you on your toes, right? If you don't know where next year's budget's coming from, you don't slack off. Where somebody who is in a tradition where the church is fully funded, uh, there's less incentive, to put American language on it. There's less incentive to excel. And so, yeah, but it has a dark side also, and that's just true. That's what makes the history of it interesting. So next week we'll get to a different chapter in the ways what's the matter?
Isn't next week Thanksgiving?
Oh, you're 100% right. The week after Thanksgiving,
Okay.
week after, 2 weeks from tonight, what we'll get to another chapter of how evangelicals tried to engage society, and that's what the rise of the moral majority. And the moral majority in 1980, Jerry Falwell and the election of Reagan, this is major shift in the ways evangelicals and fundamentalists engage society. And it also, I think, has its lineage in the Scopes trial. And so we'll talk about that in 2 weeks' time. And what we'll do is we'll go. I'm looking at a calendar here. Forgive me just a second. So we'll have Thanksgiving off, and we'll come back on December 4th. And it's possible that that'll be our last one for Advent, because the Advent schedule gets very busy, and people are traveling and things. So we'll take a break and we'll reconvene in January and shift. But don't miss December 4th. That will be an interesting conversation for us. Any parting shots? I really appreciate the Elliots gave me this article from their newspaper in Prescott. This is the one I read in the beginning, where the explanation for school shootings was that they teach evolution in schools. You might think that was right out of 1925, but that was 2025. Any other questions or comments or? Okay. Let me close us in prayer. God, we thank you for the ways that you call us to engage the world around us, and we repent of our various traditions and the ways that we have done that well and not done that well. God, we ask that as we look at this history, that you would show us a path forward in the present and in the future for how we can be reflections of who you really are in the world that we live in. We lift that up to you, and we lift our church up to you as we come up on Christ the King Sunday and the Advent season, that we would feel these moments of the church year in a very deep and meaningful way. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.